Hello everyone, welcome to my next free tutorial Friday. And this week I decided I would switch gears and do a little bit of an environment sketch. So this is a hand sketch that I did with Pilot Hi-Tec C pens. And I had done, as you can see, there's a loose marker sketch there. And I had roughed it out like I do a lot of my thumbnail sketches and vehicle sketches, where I just rough in the basic forms and shapes and the perspective with like a Copic marker, usually a 0 number, just enough for myself to see. And then I go back over the top and I ink it with a fine pen like a Pilot Hi-Tec C. So that's what I've used here, or I think it's just Pilot Hi-Tec. Anyway, so I've taken that drawing, which was about, I don't know, 9 inches, 8 or 9 inches wide, and I've scanned it and I've brought it into Photoshop. And you can see now all I'm doing here is just using a little color dodge brush. And this is how I go around and clean up my edges. And what's nice is you can be a little sloppy with it. So it's just a brush, soft edge airbrush set to color dodge. And I'm color dodging to pure white. And that helps me clean up some of the edges. And now I'm putting in a background layer just as a gradation. And now because my line drawing is there, I can make quick selections. And you'll see I deleted part of my hill there, but I'll go back and add it later. So this is a really fast way to block in areas, and so I'm just trying to pick. And some areas there's holes in my line drawing, so I have to go in and make a little more accurate selection. But just to get started, that's a good way to go. And now I've got to go back and patch a couple of layers. So I'm going to patch up that hill, a couple of areas I lost here as well. And the whole goal for this quick tutorial, this one's going to be a little faster than last week's long lecture. This one's about 14.5 minutes this week. And what I wanted to do was just block out some values to see if this is a scene that I want to spend any more time on. And it's basic, 1-point perspective. And it's just a big sci-fi cityscape sort of thing. And I want a clear blue sky day, although it's not going to be blue. So now this is just an exercise in adding atmospheric perspective. So what I'm doing now is I'm just taking my entire landscape, all my buildings and things that are foreground and middle ground and a couple way in the distance there. And I've just made it all darker just by adjusting the levels. You can see I've got a couple more little holes there to fix where my selection wasn't so great. And really what I wanted to start to do is add atmosphere. So when we look straight up, we don't look through as much atmosphere as when we look out towards the horizon. And when we look out towards the horizon in any direction, there's a lot of dust and particulates and smog and those sorts of things as compared to when we look straight up. So that's what I'm adding here. I'm adding basically layers of atmosphere in the distance. And then I'm just going to come back and start to erase out and delete the architecture in the foreground and the middle ground that's blocking me from seeing that distant atmosphere. So I'm just going to lay successive layers of atmosphere over my scene and then come back, and each step along the way I'm just going to erase the buildings that get closer, closer, closer to where my camera position is. So here you see I'm leaving the buildings in the far, far distance, and I'm erasing everything in the foreground and the midground. And what you're going to start to get is atmospheric perspective. And atmospheric perspective is basically as the contrast reduces, as the atmosphere blocks our view of things that are far away in the distance. So I'm just making decisions, what's going to be on this middle ground plane, what's going to be in the far distance. And just by erasing or not erasing, I'm getting it to be included there. So that's sort of a bridge structure, some roadway supported by some verticals connecting to these buildings that's going through the midplane, the midground there. And first job is just to separate my foreground, my midground from the background. So I really just have the clouds and the dust and smog off in the distance, right over the horizon. And so this is really I think the best way to start with your environments is to block out your values. And if you can get all your values working first, then you can come back and colorize and add textures and start layering in photography, etc. But if you can get your drawing to work at this level, your sketch, it's going to be much, much more successful. So these are the very first steps. And in fact, that's what this entire tutorial is about, which is just blocking out the values. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time blocking out the subtle form changes of the buildings. I just want to do the entire scene and try to establish the atmosphere first and get the depth working. So it's really an exercise in creating depth using atmosphere. So I grab a big airbrush and now I start painting over the midground buildings because I need to separate those from the foreground. So that's a bridge right there in the foreground, so we see through back down to the ground. So I'm just adding more atmosphere, and this could be like ground fog, smog, that sort of thing. So I'm deciding where do I want to push that, what buildings are where in space. And I just come back now and start erasing. So this is my foreground elements, and that little tower thing there is attached to that corner of my foreground platform. Same with this one. And then it's going to run across there and then up into this foreground building. So I've got sort of like this foreground building on the right, this platform with a bridge, which I'm just now cutting out through here. It's kind of the second depth area, and then I've with those two little tech towers there. And there's some more buildings off there in the distance behind. And so if I just erase out to that corner, right, I can get that separation to work. And I just did that with a layer mask. And the nice thing about the layer mask is I can go back and make changes. And you can also change the opacity now of that and vary it a bit. So I want to push that one back. I don't want to go as far back as that bridge structure in the distance, but it needs to be separated from my foreground element. So I'm just going to keep pushing more and more atmosphere into this piece, establishing my depth. And I haven't really thought about my lighting yet, right? I really haven't picked the position of my sun, haven't thought about any of that. I'm just trying to get atmosphere. I'm just trying to get separation. So there I added a little multiply layer over the top to darken my foreground. I just added another one. And here I'm softening those a bit, trying to get some subtle separation between that little wall that comes towards us and that wall that's perpendicular to us in the distance. This is fairly high up in the sky there. And adding a little bit more gradation across there. And erasing, I wanted to add it, it's always like subtle balances, right? You're just like touch here of atmosphere, touch there. And the thing about your brain is that it's really high resolution when it comes to being able to decipher value changes. So you can make very subtle value changes and our brain can pick that up. Unlike color, our brain tends to be quite low resolution when we observe color. So value is the way that our brains decide where things are in depth, where they are in space. And that's why this works so well to give you a sense of depth, because that's all I'm using is just value. So here I've decided I'm going to put my sun in the upper right, and it's going to cast a shadow of these elements, these horizontal structures above onto that vertical wall. And so I'm just guessing here at the position of the light, or I should say the direction of the shadows. And later, actually on my Facebook page, I blocked this out in 3D as well in Modo, and I tried to match it, and it was just I was testing how long it took to do blocking in 3D and positioning the sun to get my block in for an underpainting versus doing it traditional media and doing it this way that I'm doing right now. And it turned out to be about the same time. They were both about 2 hours, including the marker, the pen sketch, and the value block in Photoshop. This was about 40 minutes total, and I've sped it up to about 14 and a half. And the Modo one was 2 hours complete, start to finish. Of course, I knew the design, I knew where I was going, so I was trying to match the sketch. I don't know if it would have been faster or slower if I didn't know the design, but it was interesting that they're pretty much the same. And so here I'm bringing in some light from above, dropping on my horizontal surfaces. And this is how I would just block out and start to define, once I have my depths. My depth is set up for my big scene, so I like, the distant horizon's just visible. It's got quite a bit of atmosphere, which really helps the depth to show. And now I've got a color dodge layer that I'm working on. And you see it floating on the very top there. And I've just set it to blend and affect everything underneath it, but I can leave it on a separate layer. So I'm just using a soft airbrush, set to low opacity. And I'm going in and brightening up planes and trying to make surface changes. And here I think, well, there's this huge overhead structure. Maybe there could be something out of frame that we can't see that casts another shadow across this foreground building just to make it look a little more interesting. And this is obviously getting to be honest, if it's just all matte surfaces, that thing's getting a little too bright for vertical surfaces. But taking a little artistic license, maybe it's a little metallic surface or something that has a bit more, intense specularity to it. And here I'm erasing back out my atmosphere layer, trying to make those shadows a bit stronger. So, if you squint your eyes at it, you can see all the big forms. It looks like it has depth. And here, what is this, multiply layer? So here I'm adding my darks and my, the very foreground elements. And so just blocking out, basically it's just like my matte surface shading DVDs at this point. It's just like block out and get a good 1, 2, 3 read. So shadow sides are, the darkest. Then you have to make a decision between the two other surfaces that are in the light to get a good 1, 2, 3 read of those 3 surfaces that are visible. And it's always balancing, you put light against dark, dark against light. So the little tower building here on the far right is lighter, so I know I want to push that little angled wall into shadow so I can make that light against dark. And then, other areas are going to be dark against light, like those 2 little middle towers in the foreground on that little horizontal platform there, just above that bridge element. Those are dark against light, as is the big midground structure. So that's usually just that's the illustration trick, is just light against dark, dark against light, and you use either fog or clouds or smog or lighting or cast shadows or a wall in shadow, etc., to try and set up those rhythms throughout your value block-in. So here I'm just scrubbing around. I just have like this little elliptical hard edge brush, and I just go around with just multiply layers and color dodge layers. And here I'm checking my composition. Probably should have done a little bit earlier, but flipping it horizontal and looking at it and see if there's things I want to tweak or change. And here I've got all my layers set up for my atmosphere, so I can start playing around with increasing the atmosphere, increasing the contrast. Like I said, it's very subtle, and your brain does a really great job of identifying those subtle value changes. But so you can sort of sneak up on it and take your time blocking out stuff and just keep tweaking and tweaking and tweaking the difference between those values. So here I did a levels adjustment, and I'm just playing around now at the very top to see, do I really want to push the contrast? Can I push the foreground even further and have it still read like it's a little bit, a ways away from our camera? So this is where I decided I would select that building as an example, and then just selectively bring in some hotter values there, right? Meaning more contrast. And I'm using that with a levels adjustment. So you can see I turn and I just selected out that area. So I basically just made a layer mask for my levels adjustment. And you can then do that wherever you like. And you could also paint into that and push. And I was just checking my cast shadow value against the light surface value. And probably going to play with my sky here a bit. There's a little bit too much contrast of my structure against the sky up there. And so I thought I could push that part of the sky darker. I didn't want as much contrast through there. I like the contrast down through the lower third of the illustration. And that's really about it. So a couple more little tweaks. And that's got it pretty close. So I hope you enjoyed this week. Just a quick, almost 15 minutes on doing a little grayscale block-in of an environment. Have a great week.